So the Q2 prompt is always going to be phrased the exact same way. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices blank makes in order to convey his or her message to his or her audience, right? So here we're going to analyze the rhetorical choices that Florence Kelly makes to convey her message to her audience. The prompt also specifies that our responses should respond to the prompt with a thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. Select and use evidence to support your line of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. Demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. That's a big one that a lot of students across the country overlook. And finally, use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. That fourth one there, demonstrating and understanding the rhetorical situation, if we use this new pattern of arrangement, we can't help but do that because we're devoting an entire paragraph, paragraph 2, to pulling out elements of the rhetorical situation and explaining this significant rhetorical constraint, this obstacle that the writer faces. And we're making sure that our analysis paragraphs 3 and 4 are both based on how they're responding to that rhetorical constraint. So the pattern will help us definitely do that. The reason why I like to use this passage so much for my samples is that it's got so much that we could write about, so many different rhetorical choices that she makes in this passage. We clearly don't have time to write about all of them, and we're not intended to do so. So what I want to show you now is 3 different essay outlines that I could use to write an essay in response to this analysis prompt. So here's the first one. My thesis might go something like this. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome the socioeconomic disconnect between her audience and her subject matter by first enlightening them to the severity of the problem and then investing the audience personally in solving it. So my thesis kind of has 3 parts there. I've identified a specific rhetorical obstacle, or generally identified. Remember, I don't need to explain my obstacle yet. This is just my thesis. And then I've briefly identified 2 different rhetorical choices that help overcome that obstacle. So my essay outline, I'd start with my introduction paragraph, just as I talked about earlier. And then in paragraph 2, where I'm priming the audience, I'm going to focus on explaining this rhetorical obstacle. I'm going to explain the socioeconomic disconnect between the audience, who's made up of middle class and wealthy women predominantly, and explain the disconnect between that and Florence Kelly's subject matter, which is poor working children. With that obstacle explained in paragraph 2, paragraph 3 is going to analyze the ways in which Kelly first attempts to enlighten the audience on just how terrible and widespread the issue of child labor is. Because if it's something they feel a disconnect with, they first need to be educated on what it is. I'll follow that up in paragraph 4 by analyzing the ways in which Kelly uses her audience's newfound knowledge and understanding of the issue to make them care personally about it. And I'll talk about some of the emotional appeals that she uses to kind of build off of that logos knowledge and turn that into kind of a pathos caring about the situation. And then, of course, finally, I'll wrap it up with my standard conclusion paragraph. Here is another way that I could approach this analysis, looking at some different rhetorical choices and a different obstacle. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome the apparent difference between her cause and the cause that the audience has attended the conference to support by first making the issue of child labor sympathetic to the audience and then linking the struggle against child labor with the audience's struggle for suffrage. Okay, so different obstacle here and a couple of different rhetorical choices, rhetorical goals, as I like to call them now, that the writer's pursuing to overcome that obstacle. So I'm going to start with my standard introduction. And then my second paragraph, the first body paragraph, I'm going to explain the obstacle. Here I want to explain the seemingly different goals of the speaker and the audience. We have a child labor advocate, or an anti-child labor advocate would probably be more precise there, addressing a suffrage organization. And those 2 goals would seem to be not necessarily at odds with each other, but definitely not the same thing, right? Once I've established that obstacle, I'm going to analyze in my first analysis paragraph, paragraph 3, the ways in which Kelly first attempts to make the issue of child labor sympathetic to the audience. So generally just making them sympathetic to the plight of the children workers. Then in paragraph 4, I'll talk about how she uses this sympathy to then demonstrate that her struggle against child labor can only be won by the audience first winning their struggle of getting the vote, thus giving them added fuel to their own fight. And then lastly, I'll finish it up with my standard conclusion. Let's look at one final approach to this analysis. My thesis would read this. In her speech, Kelly attempts to overcome her audience's acquiescence to child labor practices by first making the issue a moral imperative to the audience and then providing them with an accessible way to act on that imperative. Let's start off with my standard introduction. Paragraph 2, I would explain that the audience's acquiescence toward child labor practices comes from their perceived blamelessness in the issue and powerlessness to help. After all, she is talking to a group of people who at the time didn't have the power to vote, so they were kind of politically weakened by that. And so naturally they just sort of acquiesce to the whole issue. Yeah, darn, it's a terrible thing, child labor, but I'm not involved, and what can I, it doesn't affect me. I'm not the one to blame here, and I couldn't do anything to help if I wanted to. So that's kind of the obstacle that I've identified here. In my third paragraph, I'd analyze the ways in which Kelly makes the issue of child labor a moral imperative for the audience. So not just something they should care about, but something that they are morally obligated to help end. And then with my fourth paragraph, I'm going to analyze the ways in which Kelly then gives the audience a way to act on this moral imperative through a call to action that actually acknowledges the audience's diminished political power. If you remember from the speech, she gives a very specific call to action, knowing that her audience can't vote against this issue. She says that the audience can go out and instill the working men, so the male-dominated labor movement at this time, because men could vote. And then lastly, finish up with my standard conclusion. All right, now that you know what this new pattern of arrangement is going to look like for the Q2, go ahead and move on to completing the follow-up writing workshop assignment, which will have you look back at the Q2 essay that you wrote on the mock exam and redesign it using the new pattern of arrangement.